Let's unbox this thing, guys. Let's do it. Let's start with... Got paper manuals here. Don't need this. There you go. That's the unit. Oh, check this out. A mouse. They've included a mouse, guys. That's amazing. Okay, my assumption is that this is a keyboard, which is kind of amazing because the Corsair One does not include any of this. It's an actual keyboard. I don't think it's mechanical, but let's just see how that's gonna work out. So this is it, guys. Oh, look at her. Nice and sexy. Check this out.
The Pure Base 600 is now available with a tempered glass panel with an easy mount, a couple of Pure Wings 2 fans, one of which is 140mm, with 3 modular interior drive caddies along with dual SSD brackets. Have nothing to hide with a Be Quiet Pure Base 600.
So guys, this is the ROG G20ci desktop gaming PC from ASUS. It is meant to be a simple plug-and-play gaming PC that doesn't require any additional setup other than plugging it into your monitor. This ASUS design has been around for a little while, but the insides have received a pretty big upgrade over the previous version. There's now a setup that has a 7th generation Intel i7-7700 and an NVIDIA GTX 1080. That's some serious horsepower for such a small PC. Let's talk pricing because the G20 surprisingly fits within the desktop market. There are 2 models to choose from, starting with the base that costs $1,500, which gets you a Core i7-7700 non-K CPU, 16GB of DDR4 RAM, a GTX 1070, and a 512GB SSD. The model we have in hand costs $300 more, and it comes equipped with an extra 1TB hard drive and a GTX 1080. That's not bad for a compact gaming desktop because if you build a similarly spec'd system, you'll roughly end up being at the same price point, so ASUS is really pushing hard towards the compact enthusiast platform, and I'm impressed. Now, some of you may be wondering about that i7-7700 since other compact systems like the Corsair's One use an unlocked 7700K. I actually like the fact that ASUS went this route since this processor costs less and the audience being targeted by the G20ci cares more about ease of use than extreme overclocking. What's interesting about this system is just how much performance ASUS has managed to pack into such a small form factor. Now, just for reference, the Corsair One is 12 liters in volume, but the G20 is 9.5 liters, yet both have very similar specifications. The G20ci is basically a slim tower that can easily be transported to LAN parties, and it includes some aggressive design elements too. The front grille, for instance, acts as a cool showcase for the RGB lighting inside, plus it helps with airflow. The singular red band around the center of the chassis defines the ROG branding really well, and check this out. Even the front USB ports and audio jacks have been modified to match the color scheme that ASUS was going for. Really cool stuff, and it looks pretty tasteful. I know everyone thinks of design differently, but I really like what ASUS has done here. In terms of build quality, it's mostly plastic, but that's necessarily not a bad thing. It's put together really well, and the reason I say that is because the material that they've used isn't cheap. The stealth black exterior isn't glossy, so don't be afraid of fingerprints, plus they've added these angular edges on the sides to give it some character. In person, it looks amazing. In addition to that sleek design, ASUS has also included a mouse and keyboard. Now, these aren't super high-end peripherals, but they're actually quite decent and they add some extra value. The keyboard, for instance, is membrane, so don't expect it to be as pronounced as a mechanical keyboard. It does get the job done really well. In fact, I did most of my benchmarking with this keyboard and I actually had no issues with that. Although, the problem with this keyboard is that it doesn't feature anti-ghosting or N-key rollover. So if you're in the middle of a gameplay session and if you're sort of using your WASD keys and if you want to switch weapons instantaneously, you might have some trouble with that. The included mouse was actually a little too small for my taste, but it's pretty decent, although I wasn't able to use it for that long because I have big hands, so it's something that you need to keep in mind. The I/O is well laid out throughout the system. Taking a peek at the back, there are 2 USB 3.1 Gen 2 ports, 4 USB 3.1 Gen 1 ports, Gigabit Ethernet, 7.1 audio and SPDIF jacks, Kensington lock, a single USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C port that supports quick charge, and 2 power jacks, which I'll talk about shortly. I'd like to see that Type-C move to the front panel for easier access, but it is still good to see it included. Display I/O is also fairly straightforward. I mean, they've managed to pack a fully fledged GTX 1080 inside, so expect the standard layout found on other Pascal GPUs like dual link DVI, dual HDMI 2.0, and dual DisplayPort 1.4 ports. The front features 2 USB 3.1 ports, a headphone and microphone jack, and yes, ASUS has also managed to fit a slim DVD drive, so no one is left out of the equation. The power button is placed at the top. It's nice and subtle, plus it blends in really well with the ROG design. ASUS has really spent some serious hours perfecting the design of the G20 without compromising on port selection. Awesome stuff, guys. Coming back to those power jacks at the back, this is where things start to get a little interesting. Since the G20 is so small, there wasn't space inside for a dedicated power supply, so that means external power bricks. Yes, that's right, not one, but 2. Each must be connected to a separate input jack, and each of those support a different input power standard. In this case, the top takes 180 watts and the bottom 230 watts. To some people, lighting on a desktop PC is just as important as having high-end hardware these days. I won't get into the sad state, but at least ASUS has both bases covered. RGB is the new trend and people love to color coordinate their hardware to match their setup. But with that being said, the lighting here is fairly subtle, but I think it looks great. There are 3 zones that can be customized through the software. This includes the 2 lighting strips behind the front grille and a single zone at the bottom of the chassis. There are 3 effects that can be tweaked around through the Aegis 3 software, which comes pre-installed. In this case, I can have the front left zone to display a pulse effect and the right output a wave effect cycling up to 10 colors. Once again, customization is endless and you always have the option to turn it off. While we're on the topic of Aegis 3, let's dive in a little closer. If I were to describe it in simpler terms, it's a much fancier way to monitor system stats. As you can see, it constantly monitors the CPU and GPU clock speeds along with CPU temperatures. You can also view your RAM and hard drive usage, and there's a visual graph to give you a clear representation for the stats. Fan control can also be done here within Aegis 3. There are 2 modes, performance and silent. I highly recommend silent because when used with performance mode, this thing sounds like a jet fan under load. This is a pre-built system from ASUS, so definitely expect some bloatware out of the box. Programs like a trial version of McAfee Antivirus, ASUS's dedicated suite for Office, and a few others can be found, so be aware of that. Now, one of the reasons why people prefer pre-built systems over building their own PC is simply because they might find building a PC and loading it up with Windows a little bit overwhelming. Of course, I can be the judge for the majority of our audience here, but think about it this way. If one of these arrives at your doorstep, all you need to do is unbox, set it up just like setting up a gaming laptop or a regular laptop, plug in power, peripherals, which by the way come included in the package, and off you go. Download your favorite titles and bam, start gaming. If something goes wrong with the system, you have reliable customer service, which is pretty awesome because you are not left alone trying to figure things out. And trust me, it's always good to have help. With that being said, the G20 has its ups and downs, and if I were to describe my experience with it in simple terms, it was intriguing. Let's take a look at some performance numbers just to set up a stage for me to share my thoughts, and feel free to add yours in the comments later on. Now remember, there are quite a few competitors in this space, and I'll be taking a look at a few more in the near future, but for now, I compared the G20 to the Corsair One simply because they both feature identical specs except for the processor. And as you can see, this was expected. The 7700 scored almost 100 points below the 7700K with stock settings, and the high result is due to their respective base and boost clocks. I also performed our standard Premiere Pro render test exporting a 1-minute 4K H.264 video, and the G20 took 16 seconds longer to complete the task compared to the one at stock settings. Now onto some gaming. Battlefield 1 at 1440p set to Ultra averaged just a little over 60 frames per second and dipped into the high 40s. That's pretty decent given how small this PC is. Overwatch at 1440p set to Epic settings averaged around 120 frames per second and dipped just a tad above 100 frames per second. Doom at 1440p set to Ultra using the Vulkan API averaged just a little under 110 frames per second And finally, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Violence, which is a heavily demanding title, averaged about 62 frames per second and minimums hitting the low 50s. So there's no denying for the fact that the choice for the CPU can affect gaming frame rates, especially if you have access to overclocking. Now remember, depending on the load, the difference between a 7700 and 7700K can be between 300 MHz and 600 MHz. That can make a pretty big difference. CPU and GPU temperatures were also decent. Once again, you have to consider that there are no liquid cooling elements on the G20 like the Corsair One, and this is partly why the G20 costs significantly less than the One. Compromises have to be made, right? The SanDisk X400 M.2 SSD inside the G20 is SATA based, so don't expect crazy read-write performance compared to a higher-end NVMe drive, but it is sufficient enough to launch applications quickly. The 1TB hard drive also dished out respectable numbers, and from my experience benchmarking, I didn't have to wait too long for game scenes to load up since most of my games were installed on this drive. Having that extra storage space is great, especially when some games are pushing past the 60GB mark these days. All in all, the G20ci is a very capable machine, and I sure had fun gaming on it, except for this. Now during idle scenarios, the G20ci operates almost silently, but under load, things change up quite a bit. Noise became the only annoying factor here. In its performance mode, it sounds like a jet fan, and the silent mode does quiet things down a little bit, but not that much. This is where I give value to the Corsair One, since it's not only powerful, but also super quiet. I mean, go back and listen to the sound test when I'm comparing the two. The difference is night and day, but then again, you pay for it since Corsair's system is a lot more expensive. Personally, I think that the G20ci is an excellent system for people who are just looking for a good gaming PC that can be set up in just a few minutes. While DIY systems may offer a slightly better value for people who are comfortable building their own, ASUS has managed to create a compact, well-priced, and high-performance system. The only problem here is the fan noise, but I'm hoping ASUS can fix that in the future. And that's where I'm going to end this review. I want to hear your thoughts about the ASUS G20ci. Let us know in the comments down below, and if there are any alternatives, feel free to let me know in the comments down below as well. Once again, I will be doing a lot of system reviews in the future like this, so stay tuned for that. I'm Ibor with Canucks. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.